The Henderson Hills Homeowners Association sent me a certified letter on a Tuesday morning, threatening legal action over something they claimed was creating a public nuisance and olfactory disturbance in my backyard, which was just their fancy way of saying my compost bin smelled bad. I stood in my kitchen in Asheville, North Carolina, holding the letter with one hand and my morning coffee with the other, reading the complaint 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My name is Frank Sullivan, and I'd lived in this neighborhood for 6 years without a single problem until the new HOA board took over last spring. The letter was signed by Patricia Donovan, the HOA president, who'd moved in 8 months ago, and immediately made it her personal mission to police every single property within a 5-mile radius. "This is insane," I muttered, setting down my coffee cup hard enough that it sloshed onto the granite countertop. The complaint stated that my compost system violated Section 14.3 of the HOA bylaws regarding unsightly structures and malodorous installations. I'd built that composting setup myself over the past 2 years, carefully researching the best methods for turning kitchen scraps and yard waste into rich, dark soil. It wasn't just some pile of rotting garbage. I had 3 separate bins working in rotation, proper ventilation, the right mix of green and brown materials, and I turned it regularly to keep everything aerobic and odor-free. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just 3 weeks earlier, I'd submitted an application to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality for their annual Residential Sustainability Award. I'd spent months documenting my composting system, my rain collection barrels, the native plant garden I'd cultivated to support local pollinators, and the solar panels I'd installed on my south-facing roof. The application included photos, detailed descriptions of my methods, and calculations showing how much waste I'd diverted from landfills over the past year. The answer was supposed to come in about 2 months, and now Patricia and her band of neighborhood enforcers wanted to dismantle everything I'd worked for. I grabbed my phone and called my neighbor, Greg Mitchell, who lived 2 houses down and had been my friend since I moved to the neighborhood. He picked up on the second ring. "Please tell me you got one of these ridiculous letters too," I said without preamble. "What letters? What are you talking about?" Greg sounded like he'd just woken up, which wasn't surprising since he worked night shifts at the hospital as an ER nurse. "Patricia Donovan, the HOA. She's claiming my compost bins violate some obscure bylaw about smells." Greg laughed, but not in a humorous way. "Man, she came after me last month about the height of my mailbox post. Said it was 3 inches too tall and made me remeasure it 4 times before she'd admit I was right and she was wrong. She never actually apologized, just sent me another letter saying the matter was resolved without violation. This woman has way too much time on her hands. Well, she's giving me 10 days to remove the entire composting system or face daily fines of $200. I looked out my kitchen window at the 3 neat cedar bins in the corner of my yard, partially screened by the forsythia bushes I'd planted specifically to make them less visible. I can't even see how this violates anything. The bins are well maintained, they're in my backyard, and they definitely don't smell. "You want me to come over and take a look?" Greg offered. "I've got the day off, and honestly, I'm curious to see what she's complaining about this time." 20 minutes later, Greg stood in my backyard with his hands on his hips, examining my compost setup like he was inspecting a crime scene. The morning sun was already warm for early May, and birds chirped in the oak trees that lined the property. My yard backed up to a small wooded area, which was one of the main reasons I'd bought the house in the first place. The privacy and natural setting were perfect for my sustainable living experiments. "Frank, I don't smell anything," Greg said, walking right up to the bins and taking an exaggerated sniff. "Actually, that's not true. I smell dirt. Good dirt. Like the kind you'd want to grow tomatoes in." "That's because it's working properly," I explained, lifting the lid on the middle bin to show him the dark, crumbly mixture inside. "When you maintain the right carbon to nitrogen ratio and keep everything aerated, there's no smell. The only time compost stinks is when it goes anaerobic, which happens when people just throw stuff in a pile and ignore it. I turn these every few days." Greg shook his head. "So what's her actual problem? Did she even come look at it herself?" According to the letter, she received multiple complaints from concerned residents about the smell. I made air quotes with my fingers, but she didn't specify who complained or when. For all I know, she's making it up entirely. "Wouldn't surprise me," Greg said. "You know the Hendersons sold their house because of her, right? Jim told me before they moved that Patricia kept citing them for having their trash cans visible from the street on non-collection days, even though they kept them in their garage with the door closed. She'd apparently walk up their driveway and peer through the garage door windows to look for violations. I hadn't known that, but it aligned perfectly with everything I'd heard about Patricia since she took over the HOA. She'd run for president on a platform of maintaining property values and community standards, which apparently translated to harassing homeowners over minor aesthetic preferences. The woman was in her late 40s, drove a pristine white Mercedes SUV, and always dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon, even when she was just checking mailboxes for compliance. "I'm not taking the compost system down," I said firmly. "I'll fight this." "Good," Greg said. "Want me to come with you to the next HOA meeting? You're allowed to bring witnesses and support, and I'd love to see Patricia try to justify this nonsense in front of the whole neighborhood." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the Henderson Hills Community Center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that mostly got used for holiday parties and the occasional wedding reception. I spent the week preparing my defense, printing out articles about proper composting techniques, photos of my setup from every angle, and a copy of my pending application for the State Environmental Award. I even went door to door to my immediate neighbors and asked if they'd ever noticed any smell from my backyard. Mrs. Chen, who lived directly behind me, seemed confused by the question. "Smell? No, dear. I've never smelled anything from your yard except maybe flowers in the spring. Why do you ask?" I explained the situation, and she immediately offered to write a statement in my defense. "That woman came to my house 3 times last summer about my bird feeders," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "She said they were attracting vermin, but I think she just doesn't like birds. I told her if she bothered me again, I'd contact a lawyer. She hasn't been back since." By Thursday evening, I had statements from 4 neighbors, none of whom had ever noticed any odor from my property. I also had printed copies of the relevant HOA bylaws, which I'd read cover to cover twice. Section 14.3, which Patricia had cited, was vague at best. It prohibited structures or installations that create unsanitary conditions or produce offensive odors detectable from neighboring properties. The key word was detectable. If nobody could smell anything, how could there be a violation? Greg picked me up at 6:45, and we drove to the community center together. The parking lot was more crowded than usual, which surprised me until I realized that word had gotten around about my case. Apparently, a lot of homeowners were tired of Patricia's overreach and saw this as a potential turning point. Inside, The main room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the HOA board sat. Patricia occupied the center seat, flanked by 4 other board members: Robert Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, Linda Martinez, Douglas Freeman, and Jennifer Walsh. Patricia wore a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, her blonde hair styled in what I called the speak to the manager cut. She looked up as Greg and I entered, and her expression tightened. "Mr. Sullivan," she said coolly, "I'm glad you could join us this evening." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, taking a seat in the front row. Greg sat beside me, and I noticed Mrs. Chen settling into a chair a few rows back. Other familiar faces filled the room, including the Rodriguezes, the Palmers, and Tom Wilson from the corner house, who'd gotten into a documented feud with Patricia over his holiday decorations. The meeting started with the usual business: approval of last month's minutes, financial reports, and updates on neighborhood maintenance projects. Patricia ran through each item with mechanical efficiency, her voice crisp and authoritative. When we finally reached new business, she cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "We have a matter to address regarding a violation at 247 Oakmont Drive," she began, using my address instead of my name like I was some kind of criminal. "The property owner has been notified of non-compliance with HOA bylaws regarding offensive odors emanating from an unauthorized composting structure." "Point of order," I said, standing up. "The structure isn't unauthorized. I submitted a request for approval 2 years ago when I built it, and nobody objected. I have the email confirmation from the previous board president." Patricia's jaw tightened. That approval was granted under different leadership and did not account for subsequent complaints about the smell. "What complaints?" I challenged. "Who complained and when? I'd like to know who these concerned residents are, since I've talked to everyone within smelling distance of my yard and none of them have any problem with it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Patricia shuffled some papers in front of her, clearly uncomfortable. "The complaints were submitted anonymously through our HOA website portal." "How convenient," Greg muttered beside me, loud enough for people nearby to hear. Several chuckled. "Anonymous complaints shouldn't carry any weight without verification," I argued. "Anyone could submit a fake complaint through a website. Did you or any board member actually come to my property to verify that there's an odor?" Patricia's face flushed slightly. "I drove past your house and could detect an unpleasant smell from the street." "That's impossible," I said flatly. "My compost bins are in my backyard, at least 100 feet from the street, behind a privacy fence and landscaping. There's no way you could smell anything from your car." "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Sullivan?" Patricia's voice rose slightly, losing some of its practiced control. "I'm saying you're mistaken," I replied carefully, "and I'd like to present evidence to support my case." I held up the folder I'd brought, and Patricia reluctantly nodded. I distributed copies of my neighbor statements, photos of the compost system, and articles about proper composting techniques. As the board members reviewed the materials, I explained my process in detail, emphasizing that a well-maintained compost system produces no offensive odors. "I've also applied for the North Carolina Residential Sustainability Award for this system," I added. "The state's Department of Environmental Quality is currently reviewing my application." It seems counterproductive for the HOA to force me to dismantle an environmentally beneficial project that might bring positive recognition to our entire neighborhood. That last point made several board members look up with interest. Linda Martinez, who'd always seemed more reasonable than Patricia, leaned forward. "You applied for a state award." "I did. The application includes documentation of my entire sustainable living setup." The compost system, rain collection, native plant garden, and solar panels. If I win, it comes with a plaque, media coverage, and recognition for Henderson Hills as an environmentally conscious community. Patricia's expression suggested she'd swallowed something sour. That's irrelevant to the current violation. Is it, though? Tom Wilson called out from the back of the room. Seems pretty relevant to me. If the state government thinks Frank's setup is award-worthy, maybe the HOA should back off. Hear, hear, several people called out. The mood in the room was clearly shifting against Patricia. I'd also like to note, I continued, pressing my advantage, that Section 14.3 of our bylaws requires that odors be detectable from neighboring properties. I have written statements from 4 immediate neighbors confirming they've never detected any smell. Without evidence of an actual violation, the HOA has no grounds to demand removal of the compost system or impose fines. Robert Chen, one of the board members, spoke up. Patricia, did you document the smell you claimed to detect? Take any photos or air quality readings? I didn't think that was necessary, Patricia said stiffly. The complaints were sufficient. Anonymous, unverified complaints, I reminded everyone, versus signed statements from actual neighbors who live adjacent to my property. Jennifer Walsh, another board member, raised her hand timidly. I'd like to make a motion to table this matter until we can conduct a proper investigation. Maybe form a committee to visit Mr. Sullivan's property and assess whether there's any actual violation. Second, Linda Martinez said immediately. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but the rules of order were clear. All in favor, 4 hands went up, only Patricia abstained. The motion carried. Fine, Patricia said through gritted teeth. We'll schedule a site visit for next week. This meeting is adjourned. As people filed out, several neighbors came up to shake my hand and offer support. Mrs. Chen squeezed my arm. You did wonderfully, dear. Don't let that woman intimidate you. Greg and I walked back to his car, both feeling cautiously optimistic. She looked pretty pissed, Greg observed. Watch out for retaliation. What else can she do? I asked. She's got nothing on me. The compost system is legal, it doesn't smell, and I have the support of my actual neighbors. I should have known better than to tempt fate with questions like that. The following Tuesday, I received another certified letter from the HOA. This one cited me for unauthorized modifications to exterior structures because the cedar bins I'd built for the compost system allegedly didn't match the architectural guidelines for our neighborhood. According to Patricia's new interpretation of the rules, any outdoor structure required pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which I supposedly hadn't obtained. I was standing in my kitchen again, reading this fresh nonsense, when my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a local area code. Mr. Sullivan, this is David Park from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. I'm calling about your Residential Sustainability Award application. My heart jumped. Yes, hello, thank you for calling. I wanted to let you know that your application has been selected as a finalist, David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. We were really impressed with the comprehensive nature of your sustainable living practices, particularly your composting system. We'd like to schedule a site visit to verify the details and conduct an interview for the final evaluation. Would next Thursday work for you? Absolutely, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline rush. What time? How about 10 in the morning? I'll bring our photographer too, since we like to document finalist properties for our annual report. After we confirmed the details and ended the call, I immediately called Greg to share the news. Then I called Mrs. Chen and Tom Wilson, and basically everyone who'd supported me at the HOA meeting. By evening, the news had spread throughout the neighborhood. I was a finalist for a state environmental award. The scheduled HOA site visit to assess my compost bins happened that Friday. Patricia showed up with the 4 other board members at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. I'd taken the day off work specifically for this, wanting to be present to address any concerns directly. I met them in my driveway and led the group around to my backyard. It was a beautiful spring morning, cool and clear, with the sweet smell of flowering trees in the air. My yard looked its best, the grass freshly mowed, the native plant garden bursting with color, and the 3 cedar compost bins sitting neatly in their designated corner. "As you can see," I said, gesturing toward the setup, "everything is well maintained and organized. The bins are constructed from untreated cedar, which is rot-resistant and environmentally safe. Each bin serves a different stage of the composting process." Linda Martinez walked closer to examine the bins. "May I look inside?" "Of course." I lifted the lid on the active bin, revealing the layered contents. "This is the current working bin. I add kitchen scraps and yard waste here, mixing in brown materials like dried leaves to maintain the proper carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. No meat, dairy, or oils, which are the main things that cause odor problems." She leaned in and sniffed, then looked surprised. "It just smells like earth." "That's the point," I said. "Proper composting is an aerobic process. The microorganisms that break down the organic matter need oxygen. When you turn the pile regularly and maintain good airflow, you get no smell." Douglas Freeman, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "How often do you turn it?" "Every 3 to 4 days for the active bin. Once the material in here breaks down enough, I move it to the second bin to finish composting, which takes about 2 to 3 months. The third bin holds finished compost that's ready to use in my garden." Robert Chen was taking notes on his phone. "And you built these yourself?" "I did. I used plans from the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service. They're a standard design recommended for residential composting." Patricia had been standing back with her arms crossed, her expression sour. "The issue isn't how it works, Mr. Sullivan. The issue is that you built structures without architectural approval." "I did get approval," I countered. 2 years ago, before I built them. Check your records." "The previous board's approval process was inadequate," Patricia insisted. "Our current architectural guidelines require detailed plans and materials specifications for any outdoor structure." "Those guidelines were adopted 6 months ago," Linda Martinez interjected, looking at Patricia with obvious irritation. "They can't be applied retroactively to structures that were already approved and built." "That's a matter of interpretation," Patricia said coldly. "It's really not," Robert Chen said, still looking at his phone. "I'm reading the guidelines right now, and they specifically state they apply to new construction only. Existing structures are grandfathered in unless they're modified." Patricia's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Jennifer Walsh moved closer to the bins. "Can you show us the other stages?" I opened the second bin, which contained darker, more broken-down material, and then the third bin with the finished compost. The board members were clearly impressed, except for Patricia, who maintained her rigid disapproval. They asked questions about my process, the types of materials I composted, and how I used the finished product. I explained everything in detail, showing them my garden beds where I'd incorporated the compost and pointing out the healthy growth of my vegetables and flowers. After about 30 minutes, Linda looked at Patricia. "I've seen enough. There's no violation here. The bins are well constructed, properly maintained, and they don't produce any offensive odor. I move that we dismiss this complaint entirely." "Second," said Douglas. We still need to vote as a full board, Patricia said tightly. Fine. Let's vote right now, Linda replied. All in favor of dismissing the complaint against Mr. Sullivan's compost system. 4 hands went up immediately. Patricia stood rigid, her hand firmly at her side. The motion carries, Robert Chen announced. Mr. Sullivan, you're in compliance with all HOA regulations. We'll send you written confirmation within 3 business days. Thank you, I said, feeling a massive weight lift from my shoulders. I appreciate you all coming out to see the setup in person. As the board members headed back toward the driveway, Patricia lingered behind. She fixed me with a cold stare and said quietly, "This isn't over." "I think it is," I replied calmly. "The board voted. You lost." "You think you're so smart with your environmental award nomination," she hissed. "You're making the whole neighborhood look like a bunch of hippie tree huggers." "I think I'm making the neighborhood look environmentally responsible and forward-thinking," I said. "But if you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with the State Environmental Quality Department." She stormed off without another word, her heels clicking angrily on my patio stones. Greg came over that evening with a 6-pack of beer to celebrate. We sat on my back deck, enjoying the sunset and the sounds of evening birds. "She actually said you're making the neighborhood look like tree huggers," Greg laughed. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "She's just mad because she can't control everything," I said, taking a sip of beer. "The woman has some kind of compulsion to regulate other people's lives." "Well, she picked the wrong fight this time," Greg said, clinking his bottle against mine. "When's the state visit happening?" "Next Thursday. I'm already nervous about it." "Don't be. Your setup is incredible. They're going to love it." The week passed in a blur of preparation. I cleaned everything twice, trimmed plants, made sure all my documentation was organized and ready to present. On Wednesday evening, I barely slept, running through potential questions and answers in my head. Thursday morning arrived with perfect weather, sunny and mild. David Park showed up right on time in a state vehicle, accompanied by a photographer named Rachel Kim and another evaluator named Michael Torres. They were all young, enthusiastic, and genuinely excited to see my sustainable living setup. "Mr. Sullivan, thanks so much for having us," David said, shaking my hand warmly. "We've reviewed your application materials thoroughly, and we're really impressed with what you've accomplished. Today, we just want to verify everything in person and get some photos for our files." I gave them the full tour, starting with the compost system since it was the centerpiece of my sustainability efforts. David and Michael asked detailed technical questions about my process, my waste diversion numbers, and how I maintained the proper conditions. Rachel took dozens of photos from every angle, capturing the bins, the finished compost, and the gardens where I used it. "This is textbook perfect composting," Michael said, examining the contents of the bins. "You clearly understand the science behind it." "Do you have a background in environmental science or agriculture?" "No, I'm actually a software engineer," I admitted. "I just did a lot of research and followed the Extension Service guidelines carefully. Once you understand the principles, it's pretty straightforward." We moved on to my rain collection system, which consisted of 4 large barrels connected to my downspouts. I'd calculated that I collected approximately 1,200 gallons of rainwater annually, which I used for watering my garden and reducing my municipal water consumption. "And your native plant garden?" David asked, walking toward the section of my yard where I'd replaced traditional turf grass with native wildflowers, grasses, and shrubs. "I converted about 30% of my lawn over the past 2 years," I explained. "All native North Carolina species that support local pollinators and require minimal water once established. I've documented 17 different butterfly species, multiple native bee species, and regular visits from hummingbirds. Rachel's camera clicked continuously as I pointed out different plants: purple coneflower, black-eyed Susans, native asters, Joe Pye weed, and switchgrass. Michael crouched down to examine a patch of milkweed where several monarch caterpillars were munching away. "This is exactly the kind of residential conservation work we want to promote," he said, standing up with a broad smile. "You're creating habitat, reducing waste, conserving water, and reducing your carbon footprint all at once." The solar panels on my roof were the final stop on the tour. I showed them my monitoring system that tracked energy production and my utility bills demonstrating the reduction in grid electricity use. Over the past year, my panels had generated about 60% of my home's electricity needs. "I'm hoping to add battery storage next year," I told them. "That would let me store excess production and reduce my grid dependence even further." After 2 hours of detailed examination, photography, and questions, the team gathered in my living room to wrap up. David pulled out some paperwork and turned to me with a serious expression that made my stomach clench with nervousness. "Mr. Sullivan, it's not usually our practice to announce results during the site visit," he began. "But in this case, I think we can make an exception. Your application scored the highest of any residential submission we've received this year. Congratulations. You're the winner of the North Carolina Residential Sustainability Award." I literally felt my knees go weak. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious," David said, breaking into a huge grin. "Your work here is exemplary. It demonstrates that individual homeowners can make a significant environmental impact through thoughtful, well-executed sustainable practices. We'll have an official ceremony in Raleigh next month where the governor will present your award. We'll also be featuring your property in our annual report and on our website." Rachel and Michael congratulated me, shaking my hand enthusiastically. We talked for another half hour about the ceremony details, the media coverage, and what the award entailed. Besides the official recognition, I'd receive a grant of $5,000 to continue or expand my sustainable living efforts. After they left, I stood in my kitchen for several minutes, just processing what had happened. I'd won. The state government had recognized my work as the best residential sustainability project in North Carolina. My compost bins, the ones Patricia Donovan wanted to destroy as a nuisance, were now officially award-winning. I couldn't wait to tell everyone. I called Greg first, who whooped so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then I called my parents, my sister, Mrs. Chen, Tom Wilson, and several other neighbors who'd supported me. The news spread through Henderson Hills faster than gossip at a high school reunion. By evening, I had dozens of congratulatory messages, texts, and emails. Several local news outlets had already contacted me asking for interviews. The Asheville Citizen-Times wanted to do a feature article. A local TV station wanted to come film my setup for their evening news segment. The one person who conspicuously didn't congratulate me was Patricia Donovan. In fact, 3 days after the state's announcement, I received yet another certified letter from the HOA. This time, Patricia claimed that my excessive media attention and potential news crews visiting the property would create parking problems and disturb the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. She demanded that I decline all interviews and keep my award quiet and private. I read the letter twice, then started laughing. I couldn't help it. The absurdity was just too much. She tried to eliminate my compost system, failed, and now she was mad that it had won a state award. She was actually trying to prevent me from accepting recognition for environmental achievement. I forwarded the letter to a lawyer friend of mine, Daniel Foster, who specialized in HOA disputes. He called me within an hour. "Frank, this is completely unenforceable," Daniel said. "She can't prohibit you from giving interviews about your own property. That's a clear violation of your First Amendment rights, and she definitely can't force you to decline an official state award. This is beyond overreach. This is potentially harassment." So what should I do? Document everything. Keep every letter, every email, every communication from her. And I'd seriously consider filing a formal complaint against her with the HOA board. She's abusing her position as president. I thought about it for a day, then decided Daniel was right. I drafted a detailed complaint documenting Patricia's pattern of harassment. The initial false complaint about odors, the retroactive application of architectural guidelines, the attempt to silence my media interviews, and her quote about not wanting the neighborhood to look like tree huggers. I cited specific HOA bylaws about abuse of authority and sent the complaint to all 5 board members, with copies to every homeowner in Henderson Hills. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, I received supportive emails from over 30 neighbors, many sharing their own stories of Patricia's unreasonable demands and petty enforcement actions. Tom Wilson had been cited for Christmas lights that were supposedly too bright. The Rodriguezes had been threatened with fines over the color of their front door. The Palmers had been told their vegetable garden in their backyard was inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. A picture emerged of a HOA president who'd gone drunk with power, using her position to enforce her personal preferences rather than legitimate community standards. People were fed up, and my complaint became the catalyst for a broader revolt against Patricia's leadership. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Tuesday evening. The community center was absolutely packed, with standing room only. I arrived early with Greg, Mrs. Chen, and Daniel Foster, who'd agreed to come as my legal representation just in case things got complicated. Patricia sat at the head table looking rigid and defensive, her usual immaculate appearance slightly frayed. The other 4 board members looked distinctly uncomfortable. Robert Chen called the meeting to order, and Linda Martinez immediately moved to address my complaint. "We've received Mr. Sullivan's formal complaint, along with supporting statements from numerous homeowners," Linda said, her voice firm. "I think we need to address this directly and transparently. Patricia, would you like to respond to the allegations?" Patricia's face had gone pale, then flushed red. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to enforce our community standards as written in the bylaws." "You told Mr. Sullivan that his environmental award was making the neighborhood look like tree huggers," Tom Wilson called out from the audience. "That's not enforcing standards, that's personal bias. You threatened to fine me for Christmas lights that met every regulation in our guidelines." Another voice added, "You made the Hendersons sell their house because you were harassing them constantly," someone else yelled. The room erupted with similar complaints and accusations. Patricia tried to maintain order, banging a gavel that nobody paid attention to. Finally, Robert Chen stood up and raised his hands for silence. "It's clear that we have a serious problem here," he said. "As board members, we have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the entire community, not to pursue personal agendas. I'm going to make a motion to censure President Donovan for abuse of authority and recommend her immediate resignation from the board." "Second," Linda Martinez said without hesitation. "You can't do this," Patricia protested, her voice rising to a near shriek. I was elected by the homeowners. And the homeowners can remove you, Robert replied. That's how democracy works. We're calling for a vote. The vote among board members was 4-1 in favor of censure and recommendation for resignation, with only Patricia voting against. Then Robert called for a vote among all homeowners present, which required a simple majority to remove a board member under our HOA bylaws. The result was overwhelmingly in favor of removal. Out of the 87 homeowners in attendance, 72 voted for Patricia's removal. Patricia stood up, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. "This is illegal. I'll sue every single one of you." "On what grounds?" Daniel Foster spoke up from beside me. "You were removed through a legitimate democratic process outlined in your own HOA bylaws. You have no legal recourse, and frankly, if you continue to harass Mr. Sullivan or any other homeowner, they'll have grounds to sue you for harassment." Patricia grabbed her purse and stalked out of the community center, her heels clicking furiously on the tile floor. The room erupted in applause once she was gone. After the meeting, dozens of neighbors came up to thank me. Mrs. Chen was nearly in tears. "You stood up to her when the rest of us were too intimidated. Thank you." "We should be thanking each other," I said. "It took all of us speaking up to make this happen." The Asheville Citizen-Times article about my environmental award ran the following Sunday, featuring a large color photo of me standing beside my compost bins and a detailed explanation of my entire sustainable living setup. The article mentioned the initial HOA complaint and how the system that was nearly shut down had instead won a state award. The irony wasn't lost on readers. The article went viral on social media, being shared thousands of times with comments ranging from amused to outraged about HOA overreach. The local TV news segment aired 3 days later, and the reporter did an excellent job showing each component of my sustainability setup while explaining the environmental benefits. They also mentioned Patricia's removal from the HOA board, framing it as a cautionary tale about the importance of reasonable governance in community associations. Additional media attention followed. A regional lifestyle magazine wanted to do a feature spread. The North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service asked if they could use my property as an example in their composting education materials. I even got a call from a publisher asking if I'd be interested in writing a book about sustainable living in suburban neighborhoods. The award ceremony in Raleigh took place on a warm Saturday in early June. The governor presented awards to 5 different categories of environmental achievement in a ceremony at the state capitol building. When my category was called, I walked up to receive a beautiful plaque and shake hands with Governor Rebecca Ellis, who'd recently made environmental protection a centerpiece of her administration. "Mr. Sullivan's work demonstrates that environmental stewardship begins at home," the governor said in her remarks. "Through composting, water conservation, native landscaping, and renewable energy, he's reduced his environmental impact while creating a model that other residents can follow. This is the kind of individual leadership that will help North Carolina meet our climate and conservation goals." The ceremony was covered by state media, and several outlets interviewed me afterward. I talked about how easy it was to start composting, how native plants actually required less maintenance than traditional lawns, and how solar panels paid for themselves over time through energy savings. I wanted to emphasize that sustainable living wasn't difficult or expensive. It just required willingness to learn and commit to better practices. When I returned to Henderson Hills, several neighbors had organized a small celebration at the community center. Someone had made a banner reading, "Congratulations, Frank." And there was cake, punch, and a genuine feeling of community pride. These were the same people who'd stood up to Patricia, who'd supported each other through her reign of petty tyranny, and who now seemed energized about making positive changes in the neighborhood. Tom Wilson approached me with an idea. What if we started a neighborhood sustainability group? You could teach people how to compost, share information about native plants, maybe even coordinate bulk purchases of rain barrels or solar panels. That's a great idea, I said. I'd be happy to share what I've learned. Over the next few weeks, we organized the Henderson Hills Green Committee with about 20 initial members. We held workshops in people's backyards, sharing knowledge about everything from composting to energy efficiency. Mrs. Chen taught a class on water-wise gardening. Greg, who'd been inspired by my setup, started planning his own composting system. The Rodriguez family installed rain barrels. The momentum was incredible. The new HOA board, with Linda Martinez elected as president, was supportive of these efforts. They updated the architectural guidelines to explicitly permit composting systems, rain collection, native plant gardens, and solar panels, removing any ambiguity that could be exploited by future Patricia Donovans. They also implemented new rules about board member conduct and complaint verification to prevent abuse of authority. I thought the Patricia saga was over. I was wrong. In late August, 4 months after her removal from the HOA board, I came home from work to find 2 Asheville police cars parked on my street. My first thought was that someone had been robbed or there'd been an accident. Then, I saw the officers standing in my driveway, talking to Greg. I parked quickly and walked over. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" One of the officers, a tall woman with sergeant stripes, turned to me. "Are you Frank Sullivan?" "Yes, that's me." "We received a report about illegal dumping and potential health code violations at this address," she said, consulting a small notebook. "The caller claimed you were operating an unauthorized waste facility that was attracting rodents and creating unsanitary conditions." My mouth fell open. "That's completely false. Who called this in?" The sergeant checked her notes. "A Patricia Donovan. She identified herself as a concerned neighbor." "She's not exactly a neighbor," Greg interjected. "She lives 3 streets over, and she was removed from the HOA board for harassing Frank about his award-winning compost system." The sergeant's eyebrows went up. "Award-winning?" I explained the entire situation. The environmental award, Patricia's attempts to shut down my composting system, her removal from the board, and the media coverage. The officers exchanged glances. "Mind if we take a look at this compost system?" the sergeant asked. "Not at all, please." I led both officers around to my backyard. They examined the 3 cedar bins, looked inside, checked the surrounding area for any signs of rodents or unsanitary conditions. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The system was as clean and well-maintained as always. "Sir, this is clearly not a waste facility or health code violation," the sergeant said. "This is a legitimate residential composting setup. I actually have something similar at my house." "So Patricia filed a false report?" Greg asked. The sergeant's expression turned serious. "Filing a false police report is a crime. It wastes law enforcement resources and can constitute harassment if it's part of a pattern of behavior targeting an individual." "It is part of a pattern," I said. "I have documentation of everything she's done going back months." "I'd recommend you file a formal complaint at the station," the sergeant said. "Bring your documentation. If there's a clear pattern of harassment and false reporting, the district attorney might want to pursue charges." After the officers left, I called Daniel Foster again. He listened to the latest development and swore under his breath. "Frank, This has escalated beyond HOA disputes. She's now filing false police reports. You need to take the sergeant's advice and file a formal complaint. This woman needs to face consequences." The next morning, I went to the Asheville police station with a thick folder of documentation. Every letter from Patricia, copies of HOA meeting minutes, statements from neighbors, media articles about my award, and now the incident report from the false police call. I met with a detective named Marcus Hill, who specialized in harassment cases. Detective Hill reviewed my materials carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. After about an hour, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mr. Sullivan, you have a clear case of harassment here. The pattern is unmistakable. The false police report is particularly concerning because it demonstrates an escalation in behavior and a willingness to abuse official systems." "What happens now?" I asked. "I'll open an investigation. We'll contact Miss Donovan for an interview, review her phone records to confirm she made the call, and potentially file charges. Given the documentation you've provided, I expect the district attorney will want to pursue this." "I don't want to destroy her life," I said, feeling suddenly conflicted. "I just want her to stop." "I understand," Detective Hill said kindly. "But she needs to face accountability for her actions. Filing false police reports isn't a minor issue. It diverts resources from real emergencies and can have serious consequences for the people being falsely accused. If she's willing to do this to you, she might do it to others." The investigation moved forward. Patricia was contacted by police and apparently denied making the call, which was a mistake because the station's call records clearly showed it came from her cell phone. She then claimed she had legitimate concerns based on complaints she'd heard from other residents, but couldn't name any specific residents or provide any evidence of these complaints. In early October, Patricia Donovan was charged with making a false police report, a Class 1 misdemeanor under North Carolina law, and harassment. The case made local news because of the connection to my environmental award story. The narrative of a disgraced HOA president criminally harassing an award-winning environmental advocate was too good for media outlets to resist. The preliminary hearing took place in mid-November at the Buncombe County Courthouse. I had to testify about the history of Patricia's complaints and actions. Daniel Foster represented me as a witness, though I wasn't a party to the criminal case. The prosecutor, an efficient woman named Amanda Chen, presented the evidence methodically. The documented history of harassment, the false police report, Patricia's contradictory statements, and the pattern of targeting me specifically. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that her concerns were genuine and based on community standards, but the prosecutor countered with my environmental award. The HOA board's findings that no violations existed, and the statements from my actual neighbors confirming no problems. The judge, a no-nonsense man in his 60s named Judge Robert Martinez, wasn't sympathetic to Patricia's position. "Miss Donovan, the evidence clearly shows a pattern of harassment targeting Mr. Sullivan specifically," Judge Martinez said during his ruling. "Your abuse of your position in the homeowners association, combined with filing a false police report after being removed from that position, demonstrates a troubling obsession with controlling Mr. Sullivan's legitimate activities. I'm finding probable cause for trial on both charges." The actual trial was scheduled for January, giving both sides time to prepare. The holidays passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying tension. My Green Committee continued its work, now with over 40 neighborhood participants. We organized a seed exchange, planned a neighborhood-wide energy audit, and started discussions about installing electric vehicle charging stations at the community center. The trial lasted 2 days in early January. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case, calling me as a witness, several of my neighbors, the police officers who'd responded to Patricia's false report, and even David Park from the State Environmental Quality Department, who testified about the legitimacy and environmental benefits of my composting system. Patricia's defense was weak and contradictory. She claimed she'd been trying to protect property values, then claimed she'd received legitimate complaints, then finally fell back on saying she'd been under stress and made mistakes. None of it held up under cross-examination. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts, making a false police report and criminal harassment. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor requested jail time given the deliberate nature of Patricia's actions and the extended period of harassment. Patricia's attorney pleaded for leniency, pointing out that she had no prior criminal record and had already suffered public humiliation through media coverage. Judge Martinez sentenced Patricia to 90 days in jail, suspended pending successful completion of 1-year probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. She was also ordered to pay restitution for my legal fees and the costs of the police investigation. Ms. Donovan, your actions represent a fundamental misunderstanding of community leadership and personal boundaries, Judge Martinez said during sentencing. You used your position in a homeowners association to harass a neighbor engaged in environmentally beneficial activities that brought recognition to your community. When you were rightfully removed from that position, you escalated to filing false police reports. This court takes such abuse of official systems seriously. You're fortunate that the jail sentence is being suspended. I strongly recommend you use this period of probation to reflect on your behavior and develop a better understanding of appropriate conduct. Patricia left the courthouse looking defeated and much older than her years. I felt a strange mixture of relief, vindication, and sadness. I hadn't wanted to destroy anyone's life. I just wanted to compost my kitchen scraps in peace. In the weeks following the sentencing, life gradually returned to normal. The media attention faded. Patricia and her family moved out of Henderson Hills, though I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that her husband had filed for divorce. I felt bad about that, even though none of it was my fault. Her obsessive behavior had destroyed her own life. The Henderson Hills Green Committee continued to grow and thrive. By spring, we had over 60 member households, representing nearly 70% of the neighborhood. We'd helped install 15 new composting systems, coordinated a bulk purchase of rain barrels that equipped 30 houses with water collection, and were working with a solar installation company on a group discount for interested homeowners. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality featured my property in their spring newsletter and on their website, complete with detailed photos and explanations of each sustainability component. I started receiving emails from people across the state asking for advice on starting their own sustainable living projects. I created a simple website to share information and resources, and it became a modest hit within the environmental community. Local schools started reaching out, asking if I'd be willing to give presentations about composting and sustainability. I spoke to classes at 3 different middle schools and 2 high schools, showing photos of my setup and explaining the environmental benefits. The kids were surprisingly engaged, asking smart questions about climate change, waste reduction, and what they could do in their own homes. One afternoon in late March, I was in my backyard turning the compost when Mrs. Chen called over the fence. "Frank, dear, you have visitors out front." I wiped my hands and walked around to find a small group of people standing in my driveway. A woman in her 30s holding a clipboard, a man with a professional camera, and two others who looked like they might be officials of some kind. "Mr. Sullivan?" the woman with the clipboard asked. "I'm Rachel Morrison from the Environmental Protection Agency Regional Office. We've been following your work through the state's award program, and we're here about something exciting." My heart rate picked up. "The EPA?" "Yes. We're launching a new national initiative called Sustainable Neighborhoods USA, which will recognize and support residential communities that demonstrate exceptional environmental stewardship. Based on your work and the growth of your Green Committee, we'd like to nominate Henderson Hills as one of our pilot communities." I stood there stunned as Rachel explained the program. The EPA would provide technical support, educational resources, and grants to communities committed to sustainable practices. They'd help coordinate efforts across neighborhoods, connect residents with experts, and recognize achievements at the national level. Henderson Hills, because of the work we'd started, could become a model for similar efforts across the country. "This all started because I wanted to compost my vegetable scraps," I said, laughing in disbelief. "The best environmental movements often start with simple personal choices," Rachel said with a warm smile. "But you took it further. You stood up to unreasonable opposition, educated your neighbors, and built a community around positive change." That's exactly the kind of leadership we want to support and amplify. Over the next few months, Henderson Hills became increasingly involved with the EPA's Sustainable Neighborhoods USA program. We formed working groups focused on different aspects of sustainability: waste reduction, energy efficiency, water conservation, and habitat restoration. The EPA provided educational materials, connected us with university researchers, and helped us apply for grants to fund larger projects. By summer, we transformed significant portions of the neighborhood. A community composting area was established near the community center for residents who couldn't maintain their own bins. We'd planted 3 pollinator gardens in common areas using native plants. Solar panels were now on 12 rooftops, with 5 more installations scheduled. Rainwater collection systems were in place at over 40 houses. The neighborhood's overall carbon footprint had dropped measurably. The EPA featured Henderson Hills in a documentary short about the Sustainable Neighborhoods Initiative. Film crews spent 3 days in the neighborhood, interviewing residents, filming our various projects, and capturing the sense of community that had developed around our shared environmental goals. The documentary premiered at a conference in Washington, D.C., and I was invited to attend and speak on a panel about grassroots environmental organizing. Standing in a conference room in our nation's capital, talking about compost bins and rain barrels to an audience of environmental professionals and policymakers, I couldn't help but think about Patricia Donovan. Her attempt to shut down my small composting project had inadvertently sparked something much larger. If she'd just left me alone, I probably would have continued quietly composting in my backyard, maybe sharing some advice with interested neighbors, but nothing more. Instead, her harassment had forced me to research HOA law, connect with supportive neighbors, document my practices thoroughly, and ultimately apply for recognition that I might not have otherwise pursued. Her antagonism had revealed widespread frustration with HOA overreach and united the neighborhood in opposition. Her false police report had led to her criminal conviction and permanent removal from any position of authority over others. In a strange way, Patricia Donovan had been the catalyst for something genuinely positive, though not in any way she'd intended. The Henderson Hills story continued to attract attention. We were featured in Sunset Magazine's Green Living issue. The New York Times ran a piece about HOA disputes leading to environmental innovation. I was invited to speak at environmental conferences, community planning workshops, and HOA management training seminars, where I talked about finding balance between legitimate community standards and supporting residents' efforts to live more sustainably. 2 years after the initial complaint about my compost bin, Henderson Hills won its own award, the EPA's National Sustainable Community Award for communities under 500 households. The ceremony was held in Asheville, and the EPA administrator herself came to present the award. Over 300 people attended, including many from neighboring communities who'd been inspired by our example and started their own sustainability initiatives. During the ceremony, Linda Martinez, still serving as HOA president, gave a speech that brought many people to tears. 2 years ago, our community was divided and unhappy, controlled by one person's narrow vision of what a neighborhood should look like. Today, we're united by a shared commitment to environmental stewardship and mutual support. We've learned that true property values come not from rigid enforcement of aesthetic rules, but from creating a community where people actually want to live, where innovation is encouraged, and where we work together toward common goals that benefit everyone. After the ceremony, I stood in my backyard looking at my 3 cedar compost bins, still working perfectly, still producing rich, dark soil for my garden. They looked exactly the same as they had 2 years ago when Patricia first complained about them, but everything else had changed. My phone buzzed with a text from Greg, who was at the celebration gathering at the community center. "Get over here. Mrs. Chen made her famous dumplings and everyone wants to hear you tell the story about the first HOA meeting again." I smiled and headed out, locking my back gate behind me. The compost bins sat quietly in their corner, doing what they'd always done, transforming waste into something valuable, breaking down what needed to be broken down, and supporting new growth. Sometimes that's exactly what a community needs to do too.